Yeah, thank you very, very much. I know that it's Carnival, so double thanks. And also, we're at a critical moment on the one hand in the world and also with our institutions, but I think we have also the right moment to explore together some avenues for sustainability of life in its biological and cultural diversity. For this reason, I really will try to balance the theoretical aspects with the applied aspects and some horizons where we could eventually find paths to work together. And I will start with a Lycaniculus prelude to thank Dr. Christian Prinsen, who has been 3 times already in the Cape Horn Biosphere Reserve with other colleagues of the Senckenberg Museum. And lichens, they are very important in several aspects. This is just the newspaper when I took the airplane to come to Frankfurt. And you can see the date, that's Sunday, February. That was the last Sunday in February. And then líquenes subantárticos, testigos del impacto del cambio climático en el fin del mundo. And that is thanks to the collaboration with Christian. It will become more obvious during the talk. But lichens, as you all know, are very important biophysically as indicator of environmental change. In our region, we never had, for example, acid rain, and they were not subject to some of the pressures they were subject here. And in addition, here you see lichens on the rocks, on the soil, and on the forest, and this is the southernmost forested watershed in the world. This is Horn Island, and this is a big difference between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. Here we can map the watershed, and we also identify the southernmost tree of the world. It's more tricky in the northern hemisphere, there is in Russia, but there is also some competing trees in Alaska and maybe now in Greenland. But not only biophysically they are important, but they are very important culturally for many cultures, and you are aware here at the Senckenberg Museum. I will focus on one aspect of the cultural dimensions, that is the symbolic linguistic, which is something that is an avenue to address some of the complex indirect drivers of global change. And culturally, lichen are somehow fashionable today. It's like the mushrooms of the end of the world, the lichens, and lichens are a metaphor. And as a metaphor, it's very interesting. This is a film that came out last year. I advise you to watch it. It's a short film of 45 minutes, but lichens represent a metaphor that would inspire humanity to survive in the future. And that's exactly what Christian Prinsen came to do in Chile and brought me here. I will not elaborate on the film or on that more, but really that newspaper continues with, as you see, with Christian in the field, working with both Chilean and German colleagues, and that is something that really we need to address complex issues related to global change. We cannot do it only from the south, not only from the north, but we need to do it together. For that reason, really the metaphor that lichens evoke for collaboration is timely, and it's not only among individual researchers, but I think among institutes. And I was happy to learn that the Senckenberg Museum now has this Senckenberg Biodiversity in Climate Research Center. And I went a little bit through the sub-projects and research lines, and I said, I don't know who copied whom, but there are interesting intersections here between this center at the Senckenberg Museum and our initiative that is the Cape Horn International Center for Global Change Studies and biocultural conservation. And given that we have these two research infrastructures with these two research platforms, well, we have an opportunity in that case for collaboration. And the collaboration is not so simple. So the second point is that we need to address complex problems, and complex problems require more than lichens. And then the story continues to unfold, and sometimes we get paralyzed by the complexity of problems. Now, I will simplify in this talk. One of my lenses, one of my models is this biocultural model, and I want to emphasize one thing that is very important, and I have done it in the prelude already. We need to integrate biophysical dimensions, linguistic dimensions, the language. We need to change the language. If not, we're trapped. Yesterday I was at the at the Zoological Garden here in Frankfurt that I visited already 50 years ago. And I had this Kafkian image always looking at some of the mammals, some of the other animals. If we're not aware about our cage, the language as a cage, and today with social media, with fake news, with one and zeros, and mediation, we really need to take a look at language that was such an important topic in philosophy during the 20th century. And Goethe would be an inspiration for this. So we need to look at this, but also we need to find solutions. And our way to make a contribution is to build institutions, and build institutions in partnership and collaboration. So I will circle through these three areas, and I will look at three sources of knowledge through all my talk. Native American knowledge, a lot of Western traditions, because I think Western civilization is sustainable. In Western civilization and the history of Western modern history, most of the claims, most of the cultures are for life, not for capital. It's a distortion to kind of condemn the West. There is something that is unbalanced, and that is another problem. But that diversity of values is very important, and of course, the sciences. Now, when we talk about climate change and global change, I found a project that also thought, well, they are doing something that has a parallel and could serve as an initial conversation model here, which is this KISI project in Kilimanjaro. And one of the sub-projects that involve several of the Senckenberg Museum has to do with indirect and direct anthropogenic drivers. I will focus my talk on indirect drivers, but I will briefly mention direct drivers just to refresh the mind. And direct drivers are well known by most of you, and if you attended previous lectures in this series, you had several speakers talking about the emissions of carbon dioxide. And pay attention to the date 1950. This is from William Steffen et al. Bill passed away last year. Methane, so greenhouse gases, then the depletion of ozone, and acidification of the oceans. So there is something that rings the bell there in 1950. And also regarding the scale of losses of recorded losses of species and area of tropical forests, particularly the Amazonas. But with indirect drivers, we need to be careful. And to more effectively address these indirect drivers, we really need to address first the cultural dimension, particularly the symbolic linguistic, and also the socio-political institutional dimensions. The Anthropocene has been a word that has been used in previous lectures here. And many of those presenters have made one point, but I want to elaborate on that, which is it is misleading if by Anthropocene we stay at the global scale and we stay at that scale of the human species. However, this is very recurrent in the analysis and the discourses. So this is the Anthropocene. We humans have the strengths of other geological forces, we humans. And the difficulty here, even in this very interesting article by Hoekstra and Wittmann, is that we stay with that global scale that you see here, although the other scales are mentioned. But let's define a little bit when, where, who, and how. So when, the temporal dimension that I want to focus is that 1950, the great acceleration. And it's very interesting that during the 20th century, we increased population by 50%, but then almost more than 3 times, almost 3 times. And their GDP, the gross domestic product, as a proxy for economic activity, thereby production and consumption, 10 times. So the major problem, something happened there in the 1950s, that the economy started to gain an impulse that really is not comparable the first half to the second half, and many of the problems, as previous lectures have shown, have taken place during the last decades. Now, for example, energy. For example, plastic productions. Those are post-war problems of pollution and consumption. And GDP has exploded here. And this will require to have some research on where. And the same with world population, where, and this, in summary, is the when, the answer to the when. So let's focus on what has been the term popularized by William Stephan, the great acceleration, that something happened, but something happened here, and it has been characterized by people of the Resilience Institute, including Rothsturm, who was here, in terms of direct drivers. But later you will see what happens with indirect drivers. Now, where? If we look at the scenario of the previous decade, at the end 2010 more or less, most of the wealth is concentrated in 3 continents: North America, Europe, and Asia. But that is a mismatch with the population except for Asia, of course. And then these are the graphs offered by Stephan again. Who are the responsible for building large dams? And these are members of the OECD, water use, paper production, and telecommunication. And who? And the who goes in 2 aspects. One, at the accumulation of capital, which is something that called attention at the end of the 20th century, more at the beginning of this century, and even more today with the scenario we're facing in some of our countries in the Northern Hemisphere. So this is an absurd accumulation of capital in a few hands, and that brings democracy in jeopardy because you have a plutocratic regime. But on the other hand, we can do a diagnosis here on who are the main contributors to those global emissions. And this is a very interesting report, Carbon Major Reports by Griffin in California. And you see that less than 25 companies account for more than 50% or 50% of all the emissions. since the 80s. So how? And I am going to simplify, but I have the references there in order to direct the general structure of the argument here. And there are international structural problems. And the great acceleration has been driven by a grand narrative of economic progress that has resulted in processes of biocultural homogenization and suppression of vernacular knowledges, practices, and values. This is not by chance. With good or not good faith, after World War II, the winners created a new infrastructure for the world. The United Nations were created, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, several other multilateral banks, and the narratives written in the United Nations documents is that rapid economic progress is impossible without painful adjustments. Ancient philosophy have to be scrapped. And then you can see a little bit what happens, but this happened not only in the Southern Hemisphere. This happened all around the world, including in Italy, that some people were also in the reconstruction of Italy, displaced from rural to urban places. So to deepen this argument, I recommend Arturo Escobar, a Colombian sociologist and economist, Encountering Development. And this document was written in 1951. With that document, one of the barriers is that there was an impulse for migration from rural to urban cities. I was born in 1960. Most of the population was in yellow. That means rural. But today we know that most of the population is urban. And this happens not equally all around the world. We have the main concentration of urban populations in Latin America. Now, some of the displacements are not voluntary. And it's often the case that there is a conflict of interest between local communities and mega projects of mining, or in this case, monocultures of shrimps. This is northern Ecuador and southern Colombia, Esmeraldas, where still there are some mangroves, but today along Ecuador, we have more of this shrimp farming than mangroves. So that is not only a loss of ecosystem services, of ecosystem functioning, of biodiversity, but also of life habits like these concheras. Conchera means to gather shells and other products in the mangroves, and they have to migrate to cities. Then in Chile, during between 1973 and 1990, several subsidies were created as incentives for monocultures, like salmon farming, but in the land, the plantations of Monterey pine or eucalyptus. And we replaced these biologically diverse temperate forests of South America with monocultures that use pesticides, they're intensive in herbicides too, and displace local people from their traditional lands, where they gather fruits, fibers, and other plants and animals and fungi from the forest, and now they are outside the plantations. So the major consequences for these non-voluntary displacements are that urban inhabitants lose the contact, the daily contact with the biological and cultural diversity. And not only that, but really we experience in South America extreme poverty, misery in the favelas, in Rio de Janeiro, in Sao Paulo, in Las Callampas, in Santiago, and so on, in several megacities that we have in Latin America, like as Mexico City and Buenos Aires. So those are drastic for the people that suffer, but something that is very important. this is sometimes a strategy, and we face this today in Chile, to avoid negative externalities for economy by social conflicts, social environmental conflicts by communities that resist. And so we lose the guardians, we lose the custodians of those forests. And that is something that's very important, and two talks at least mentioned that word here before, but there is this displacement. So the consequences of this rural to urban switch in Latin America and other regions of the world is problematic. The second is the switch of this linguistic habitat. Our languages allow us to understand, perceive the ontology of the world, but also the values. And if we lose the language, our vernacular languages, we lose the understanding of the complexities, the refinements of modes of interrelationship between humans and other than humans, and the diversity of humans that have been co-evolving within human history and the relationship with ecosystems in a kind of biocultural co-evolution. Today, for the very first time in the history of humanity, of the human species, less than 10 languages concentrate more than half of the whole population. And this has become even more critical with what happens today with the social media and the electronic, where we are mediated by the cells and the whole networks, that even when you are in cars, I was looking yesterday in Frankfurt, like in Chile, we live more with the cell and the mediated reality than with the direct encounters of birds, but also people that can surprise us. So we need to be careful with the mediation that in modernity was the mathematical language. Today is the mathematical economic language that has values embedded, individualism at the expenses of community, self-interest at the expenses of solidarity, quick gain at the expenses of complex riparian meandering, to use a concept of philosopher Irene Klaver. So, indirect drivers. We have the omission of ethics and education. And after World War II, you know, McCarthyism in some aspect was political persecution, but also the idea that ethics was something of the past. And all ethics was emotion, and that is called emotivism, as if ethics would not have been to be learned, practiced. Of course, ethics involves emotion, but not only emotion. And when ethics started to be taught again in some Latin American countries, like Chile, where books were burned with the dictatorship of Pinochet, it was forbidden to study philosophy. Then we started to learn with the Eurocentric lens. I really like Nietzsche, Kant, but I also like Native Americans' narratives, and also not so well-known philosophers like Giambattista Vico in Italy, and who was contemporary of Descartes. So there is a lot there that we need to recover. In that context, in this talk, one aspect that we're doing with the Cape Horn International Center is the study of ethics to recover ethics. But, so a couple of considerations here. How to contribute to solving the gaps in ethics theory and education. So how to forge a philosophical concepts that overcome emotivism, that reconnect ethics with cultural and biological diversity, and that contribute to the well-being of humans and other than humans co-inhabitants. And this is not new. The call for recovering ethics is not new, and it's extremely interesting. One person that was from the region near Frankfurt in the knee, began with this, and this is, I will begin with this genealogical tree of environmental ethics that Carl Leopold, one of the sons of Aldo Leopold, who wrote The Land Ethic, published in Bioscience in 2004. And he started there with the figure of Albert Schweitzer. And Albert Schweitzer was, well, a musician, an organist, a theologian, but then he wanted to make a difference, and as a doctor went to Africa and won the Nobel Prize. But one thing that he emphasized during his whole life, but mostly at the end, is this concern that why philosophy lost its leadership at the hands of natural sciences and technology, and even undertaking an anti-human role. And so Schweitzer answers, due to the lack of ethical ideas. And he's very clear and simple. Good is maintaining life, promoting it and developing it. Evil is destroying it, inhibiting it or denying it. I'm life that wants to live amidst life that wants to live. Axiologically, this is very simple, you can say it, is to reposition the value of life above the value of capital and other values that overwhelm and override the value of life. And today, very often we make decisions based on economy, but not economy in an equity economy, but on capital. So that has been criticized by Albert Schweitzer. Second, Potter. Potter coined the terms bioethics in the US. In Germany, it was used before the term by Jäger. But I quote here Potter because he integrates human ethics and human health with ecology. And that is extremely interesting because he used the Leopoldian framework of ecology to create this field of global bioethics. To survive the threats, it is necessary to integrate biology and ethics. And I saw in the elevator, what do I mean with biocultural ethics and cohabitation? Well, I'm trying to explore these intersections like Potter did and Albert Schweitzer, and in his proposal is a science for survival, but it's very important, basically is to incorporate a certain land ethic as Aldo Leopold. Well, for some reason, Carl Leopold learned about my work, and we had apparently met at one point. We met later after he published this article, but I had to explain him that it was not ecological ethics, but biocultural ethics. And the reason is that really I want and I need to integrate these biophysical, symbolic, linguistic, and institutional dimensions. And to do it, I developed this 3H model of co-inhabitants that have life habits that can be performed in certain habitats, being those habitats biophysical, linguistic, or institutional. If those dimensions go away, we cannot be the co-inhabitants we are. And that can be explored through traditional knowledge from Western and non-Western cultures, and also of contemporary science. In order to pause a little bit and to go into transition to the last part of the talk, I will show a 1-minute video here with the notion of co-inhabitants. La piedra angular, el concepto central del Parque Omora, es el de ser cohabitantes. Cohabitantes significa compartir un hábitat. Aquí estamos en los bosques más australes del mundo, donde un líquen como barbita de viejo, como esta costra blanca, sobre este tronco, van generando el suelo que permite que crezcan estos árboles, que nos regula los flujos hídricos, nos da aire, y nosotros al comprender eso, asumimos también una responsabilidad ética del cuidado en que queremos que le vaya bien a los árboles, y nos va a ir bien a nosotros. Hoy día hablamos de una salud, ¿no es cierto? La salud de los árboles, del ecosistema, la salud de la sociedad humana. Ese sentido de cohabitar, si queremos decirlo más claramente, en una democracia de especies, donde hay un derecho a vivir de los árboles, los líquenes, los pájaros y los seres humanos, conlleva al final un bienestar material y un bienestar espiritual. Espíritu significa respirar y así respiramos en conjunto, cohabitando. Esto no es abstracto, sino que esto es muy concreto. El bienestar del conjunto de los seres vivos va de la mano con el conjunto de los seres humanos. So I wanted just to go away a little bit to practice again, and now I will put it in movement, and I will quickly go through the definitions and the origins of these 3 H. And the first H is coinhabitants, and in Spanish is cohabitantes, so you have the H in capital. And we use in Latin America a lot the word compañera, compañero. And then I learned that it came from the Latin, and it was very early in Latin language, was pre-Christian in Rome. And it means to sharing bread, cum panis. And if you really are compañero, compañero, when there is little bread, you share it. You don't eat it all. And if there is too much, you are wise enough to take the middle path. And what, however, happens is that more than 50% of the population in the world has malnutrition, either for obesity or denutrition. Well, with coinhabitants, the analogy is to share the habitat. And to share the habitat is a description. It's obvious that in this room even, we are breathing the oxygen of algae, cyanobacteria, and plants. We know that. But we still don't undertake seriously the ethical consequences of being part of that flow of gases, the exchange of gases with other organisms. And we really need to understand that this is a descriptive concept, but at the same time has a normative strength, that we should share the habitat, not only that we do share the habitat. And that is a difficult term, but that's the motion, and the motion is to explore life habits of care, and the idea of life habits intersects with the second H, which comes from